Somewhere in the National Museum of Wales, there is a stone. It was dug up in 1929 from beneath a burial mound on the Isle of Anglesey, radiocarbon dated to around 3500 BC, and for decades it was catalogued as decorated prehistoric art. Then, in 2011, a former soldier looked at it and saw something else entirely. He saw a map. He saw a constitution. He saw a writing system that, according to his research, had been in use on every continent in the world for tens of thousands of years, hiding in plain sight inside Celtic carvings, Egyptian gods, Arabian robes, and the Royal Barges of Thailand. Today, we are examining the research of an unknown soldier on iconographic writing, what it tells us about archaic history, and why it reframes something as modern and contested as Thailand's Lese Majeste Laws. By the end of this episode, you will understand what iconographic writing actually is, how the author believes it was created, and why he argues that protecting a monarch's dignity is, in fact, protecting everyone's.
The author publishes under the name An Unknown Soldier, and he is explicit about why. He writes that he is crediting the United States Armed Forces with the training that made this discovery possible. That is not a throwaway line. The method he used to decipher the writing system, what he calls soloromancy, is essentially the same sun and stick surveying technique the US Army taught him in basic training.
So the military training is directly relevant to the discovery itself.
Directly relevant. The idea is that you plant a staff upright in the ground, mark the tip of its shadow, wait a few hours, mark the tip again, and the line between those 2 points gives you a perfect east to west orientation every time. The author claims this technique is more accurate than modern GPS, and he argues that archaic scribes used exactly this method to produce cartographic documents of their realms.
Right, and that is the foundation of what he calls iconographic writing. Can you define that for listeners who are coming to this completely fresh?
So the author draws a sharp distinction between iconographic writing and what we normally think of as writing. He says conventional writing, including Egyptian hieroglyphics in their later form, modulates verbal information. Iconographic writing modulates visual information. The wisdom of a visual markup language, as he puts it, is immediately clear when you consider language barriers across the enormous geographic spread of its use. If you are trying to communicate across dozens of different spoken languages, a system based on visual geography rather than phonetics is far more practical.
And the discovery itself, the moment it clicked, that happened in Cardiff.
In 2011, yes. The author describes accidentally deciphering what he calls the Bryn Cethlethi pattern stone in the National Museum of Wales. His analysis of that single artifact runs to over 200 pages, but he says he found a more compelling example while wintering on the Costa del Sol in Spain, and that example is what he uses to make what he calls the irrefutable case.
The Dama de Elche.
Exactly. The Dama de Elche is a carved stone bust, dated to around 400 BC, long thought to be a Carthaginian funerary urn or an imported fetish. The author places it in profile next to a satellite image of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal in isolation, and argues the correspondence is, in his words, nearly irrefutable. The carving is not art. It is a cartographic document of the Kingdom of Iberia.
And that is where the compositional rules come in. Because the author is not just saying these things look like maps. He is saying there is a grammar, a syntax.
3 rules, actually. Rule 1, the constitution had to look just like the realm it documented. The borders and general details were all based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom. This, the author says, explains every fantastic headdress you see in archaic imagery across the world. The headdress was not decorative, it was geographic. Rule 3, every station of the nobility and many domains of the learned had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other.
So these compositions are simultaneously maps, censuses, and constitutional documents.
That is precisely how the author describes them. He writes that we can make alarmingly accurate correlations of iconography to geology, and from that starting point reconstruct an accurate model of the body politic going back further than he cares to state, or, as he puts it, than most of us are willing to accept.
Which brings us to the Egyptian connection, because that is where the story gets even more layered.
It does. The author argues that Egyptian hieroglyphics did not emerge from nowhere. He was convinced they represented too sudden and too dramatic an innovative leap to have no antecedents. What he found, he says, is that each Egyptian god, and not just one or two, but the entire pantheon, is a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in what he calls anamorphic similes.
So Horus, for example.
Horus is his primary example. He argues that in the geology of Egypt west of the Nile, you can find the irrefutable form of a perched Egyptian black kite, wings tucked, claws clutching the upper Nile. The god Horus originates in that geology. The reason the head of the Aboriginal Dominion is retained on a human form is because the geology looks like a black kite, not a man. And then, crucially, he notes that the Great Pyramids of Giza are situated precisely on what would be the nose of Horus in the iconographic composition.
Wait, so the pyramids were built on the nose because in iconographic compositions, the nose was always the sovereign's mountain?
That is the argument. The nose in archaic iconographic compositions was always the sovereign's mountain. Egypt's problem was that there are no appreciable mountains along the Nile Delta. So the solution, the author writes, was to build mountains. And the process by which the location was determined was soloromancy,
which is the priestly cartographic art. And I want to stay on that for a moment because the Moses passage in the research is one of the most striking sections. The author is essentially arguing that the burning bush is an iconographic description of a cartographic survey.
He is, and he is quite precise about it. He argues Moses spent 40 years in the kingdom of Midian as an apprentice soloromancer, tending flocks while systematically surveying the Sinai Peninsula from multiple vantage points, recording azimuths on his robe. The robe itself becomes the map, and the image that results from decades of intersecting survey lines, when correlated to the words of Exodus, is what Moses described as a bush burning with fire that was not consumed.
So the phonetic record, the words of scripture, and the iconographic record, the cartographic survey, are describing the same event in two different languages.
That is the author's claim. He writes that the phonetic record in context with the irrefutable iconography requires us to adjust the popular image of where Moses was when he had his epiphany. And he is careful to say he is not dismissing the canon. He says he believes the canon is correct.
There is something almost poetic about the idea that a soldier trained in basic land navigation by the U.S. Army ends up unlocking what he believes is the same technique Moses used on Mount Sinai.
The author clearly finds that resonance meaningful, and it is worth noting that he is quite self-aware about his position. He writes, and I think this is important, that there are certainly many who are better suited to this task, but as he says, finders keepers. He is not claiming to be the definitive authority. He is claiming to have found the method and to be running with it.
And the scope of what he has found is, by his own admission, almost unmanageable. He calculates that in the British Isles alone, there are over 3 million artifacts in national collections, and if he devoted 5 minutes to each, he would need to work for 150 years just to complete a first pass.
He says it would take 2 centuries of toil just to form a comprehensive opinion, which is why he frames this as the beginning of a generational project, not a finished theory. He is explicit that future generations will complete the work.
Let us talk about the chronological claims, because this is where the research becomes genuinely provocative for mainstream academia. The author proposes a new periodization of prehistory entirely.
He does. He argues that the standard terms, Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, are anachronisms. He proposes replacing what we call prehistory with 2 periods, the Archaic, which he defines as the years between the Toba eruption of 80,000 BC and 1,800 BC, and the Ancient, which runs from 1,800 BC to the Common Era.
And the Toba eruption is the anchor point for the entire framework.
It is. The Toba eruption in Sumatra was a near-extinction event. The author divides the Archaic into 4 epochs around it, what he calls the status quo ante, the state of human affairs before Toba, the catastrophe itself, which he says lasted decades, perhaps a century, the survival epoch, lasting 1 or 2 centuries, and the restoration epoch, which he believes lasted several millennia and may have continued right up to the civilizational collapse that mainstream academia already acknowledges around 1200 BC. Though he is not even convinced civilization collapsed. He raises the possibility that the diplomatic system simply reached its logical limits. He does, and he is honest that it is too early to trust that intuition. But the question he poses is haunting. If civilization did not collapse, how did an information technology used throughout the world for millennia simply fade from memory? He says the answer to that question is not one he will likely find for himself, but just the thought of it, he writes, is ominous.
And the iconographic record, according to the research, begins in 77,000 BC following the Toba eruption. That is a claim that places organized human communication tens of thousands of years before any academic consensus on writing.
It is. And the author is aware of how that lands. He says he will not get into the debate about when modern human beings existed, because the maps being deciphered will, in his view, resolve many of what he calls the delusions which currently form academic consensus. That is a bold framing, but he is consistent about it throughout the research.
Now, this is where the research takes a turn that I find genuinely fascinating, because it moves from the Mediterranean and the Sinai into Southeast Asia, and specifically into the realm of Himaphan and the Royal Barges of Thailand. Can you set that up?
So the realm of Himaphan is, in conventional academic and Buddhist understanding, a mythological place, a forest at the foot of Mount Meru, inhabited by fantastical creatures. The author argues it is not mythological at all. It is a real geographic and political entity, just obscured by the passage of time. And the iconographic creatures associated with it, the Kinara, the Garuda, the Tepanom, are not art or mythology. They are compositions in the archaic writing system, documenting the structure of the body politic.
So the Kinara, that chimeric half-human, half-bird figure, is actually a constitutional document.
According to the research, yes. The author writes that Kinara are compositions in an archaic writing system documenting the realm of Himaphan. And he argues that contrary to academic consensus, Himaphan is not a fictional place, just obscured. He dates the iconographic incarnation of the realm as it appears in Kinara form to before 2300 BC, in what he calls the pre-Vedic period, before the Mahabharata.
And then the Mahabharata itself becomes an iconographic history rather than a myth.
That is the argument. The author writes that the conflict documented in the Mahabharata, the Great War which ushered in the Vedic age, resulted in political reforms that he describes as the reincarnation of the body politic. In iconographic terms, the Kinara lost their wings and were transformed into the Tepanom, the temple guardians of Buddhist tradition. Garuda retained his wings because he was, from the first, an iconograph representing a divine being rather than a temporal political constituency.
And Garuda is specifically the avian guardian of Vishnu.
The author connects him to His Majesty King Rama X of Thailand, and this is where the research becomes most directly relevant to the Lese Majeste discussion. The author argues that His Majesty King Rama is the living incarnation of the Tepanom, the guardians of the faithful. He points to His Majesty's biography as evidence. Before joining Thailand's defenders, His Majesty was a Buddhist monk. The author writes that he thinks it essential, not just wise, to teach a warrior to pray before you teach them to fight. And then His Majesty went on to fly combat jets for the Royal Thai Air Force.
So in the author's framework, the monk becomes the Tepanom, and the fighter pilot becomes Garuda. The living person embodies the iconographic sequence.
Precisely. He writes that His Majesty Rama is not the farce that Maoist skeptics accuse him of being, but the living personification of Garuda. And he is careful to add that there is nothing ceremonial about flying a combat jet, and only a fool would treat service in the Air Force as just another box to check.
Now, the royal barges, because the author spends considerable time on them, and they are the most concrete, verifiable element of this section of the research.
The Royal Barge Procession of Thailand is a real, documented, ceremonial event. The author argues that the barges are not fancy boats encrusted with decoration. Each barge is a composition in the archaic writing system, documenting a constituent kingdom of Southeast Asia. He says each kingdom was defined by its coastline or central river, and each barge, or kingdom arc as he calls them, is a constitution in its own right.
And he names them specifically.
He does. Anantanakaraj, whose prow is composed of 7 naga representing the 7 river kingdoms of the realm. Safonahong, which translates to the Phoenix, representing a coastal kingdom that included parts of what are today the Philippines, Taiwan, Canton, Korea, and Japan. Krat Hernhet, documenting the Mekong River. The twin Ekichai barges, representing kingdoms on either bank of the Red River, and the royal barge Narai Song Suban, in which the reigning sovereign assumes what the author calls their rightful place in history.
And the procession itself, the barges moving together down the Chao Phraya River, is, in his reading, a reiteration of history spanning nearly 80,000 years.
That is the claim. He writes that together, in coordinated and honoured purpose, the fleet moves forward, and that every arm, every leg, every finger, every toe of the figurehead iconography is representative of a constituent of the kingdom. He even traces the Mekong's confluence with the Kapuas River of Borneo to a period when sea levels were low enough to walk on dry land from Bangkok to Borneo, which he dates to around 24,500 BC.
Let us get to the Lese Majeste argument, because that is the thread the author says he specifically set out to address in this section of the research. He writes that he acquired the obligation to explore the wisdom of intent behind Lese Majeste Laws because his research proves His Majesty Rama is the living incarnation of the Tepanome.
And the argument he makes is genuinely interesting because it reframes the entire debate. The conventional critique of Lese Majeste Laws, and it is a real critique, is that they protect a single privileged individual from criticism, that they are instruments of elite power used to silence dissent. The author does not dismiss that critique. He acknowledges that it is in the jealous enforcement of Lese Majeste Laws that their original intent is obscured. And he even notes that His Majesty himself reportedly raised concerns about overzealous enforcement. He does. He writes that according to news reports, His Majesty recently raised this very concern, and that knowing what he knows about His Majesty's love for the Thai people, it does not surprise him that the king would call for moderation in the judiciary. He cannot state it as a fact, but he says he is willing to bet His Majesty was taught to play chess the traditional way. It is a diplomatic way of saying the king understands the game well enough to know when his own side is overplaying.
So what is the author's positive case for the wisdom of these laws?
The argument rests on representation. He writes that His Majesty King Rama is the only person alive who is bound by faith, royal obligation, tradition, and the law to represent every man, woman, and child of Thailand. No other individual or institution can make a similar claim. And therefore, because the monarch represents everyone, an insult to his dignity is legally and morally equivalent to an insult to every person he represents.
Which is a kind of inversion of the usual critique. The usual critique says Lese Majeste elevates one person above all others. The author is saying it actually equalizes everyone through the person of the monarch.
Exactly. He writes that Lese Majeste Laws only enumerate crimes which are illegal without reiteration in Lese Majeste Laws. And he poses the question directly, what are Mao's skeptics suggesting? That His Majesty be subjected to a lower standard? He argues that if His Majesty were ever to personally weigh in on the controversy, he would confirm that he expects every Thai citizen to treat every other Thai citizen with respect. Lese Majeste Laws, in his reading, intend reciprocal dignity.
And he connects this to the Akha people, the kindreds living in the headwaters of the Mekong River across Myanmar, China, and Thailand. That is a very specific and contemporary political dimension.
It is. He describes a situation where, as he was writing, agents provocateurs were using the cause of the Akha to drive what he calls a wedge into the consciousness of all Asians, implying that the Thai people of the Chao Phraya are not indigenous to the Mekong region. And he challenges every academic in Asia with a direct question: who in Asia is not indigenous? He argues that the construct of indigenous, as deployed by what he calls Mao's skeptics, infantilizes and marginalizes the very people it claims to protect.
And his counter-argument is that the iconographic record, including the regalia worn by the Akha themselves, documents their place within the wider realm of Himaphan.
He writes that His Majesty appears comfortable in the knowledge that the Akha know who they are and where they belong, and that His Majesty will allow Akha traditions to heal where pseudoscience only injures. He says the Akha are recorded for posterity in the iconography adorning the royal barge Narai Song Suban, where all the children of Himaphan are recorded. That is a significant claim. It means the barge procession is not just a Thai national ceremony. It is, in the author's reading, a record of the entire family of mankind in the region.
And that phrase, the family of mankind, recurs throughout the research. It is the author's counter to what he sees as the divisive politics of identity and indigeneity. It does. He writes that Asians are not a species, Asians are a family. and he extends that outward. He argues that the continuity in crown iconography across the Kinara, the Garuda, and the Tepanome documents continuity in faith across the ages, and that the distinctions we make today between Buddhism, Hinduism, and what he calls the elder religion of Himaphan are, in his word, pointless. The centrally binding beliefs of every kingdom of every realm until the Enlightenment were faith in a creator and belief in an afterlife.
He even suggests the elder religion most closely resembled Shinto, though he says he does not want to delve into the reasons immediately. He gives a hint: Garuda's nest will be found at Mount Meru, which he argues is a cluster of 5 peaks in the headwaters of the Mekong River.
And Mount Meru in Hindu scripture is the sanctum sanctorum of the faithful. The author is essentially arguing that the Vatican of the pre-Vedic world is a real, locatable place in mainland Southeast Asia.
That is the argument. And he draws the parallel explicitly. He says Garuda the Lesser will be to the pre-Vedic faithful what the Vatican is today. It is a bold analogy, but it is consistent with the internal logic of the research.
The author's argument about Lese Majeste is not that criticism of power should be silenced. It is that the monarch, in the iconographic tradition, is not a person above the people, but a person who is the people, constitutionally and iconographically. Insulting that figure is, in the logic of the system, insulting the entire body politic.
And that reframing has real political stakes, because the debate in Thailand is not abstract. There are people who have faced prosecution under these laws, and there are people who argue the laws are essential to social cohesion. The author is offering a third position, that the laws are wise in their original intent, that their abuse is a distortion of that intent, and that His Majesty himself appears to agree.
He is. And he frames it in terms of reciprocity. If the yellow shirts, orange shirts, and red shirts would at least all agree on the wisdom of reciprocity, he writes, political differences would never resolve to an insult, much less violence. That is not a defense of authoritarianism. It is a plea for a kind of civic dignity that the iconographic tradition, in his reading, was designed to protect.
Here is what this really comes down to. An unknown soldier began with a stone in a Welsh museum, followed the thread through Iberian sculpture, Egyptian gods, Sinai cartography, Arabian robes, and arrived at the Royal Barge procession of Thailand, arguing that all of it is one continuous information system and that the living monarch of Thailand is its current custodian.
The author writes that every word of the Vedas, every word of the Ramayana, every word of the Mahabharata are going to resolve to facts, not myths. That is a promise to the Hindu faithful that their tradition is not allegory. It is history, written in a language we are only now beginning to relearn. We started this episode with a stone dug up from beneath a burial mound in Anglesey, cataloged for decades as decorated prehistoric art. The author looked at it and saw a constitution. He saw a map. He saw a writing system that, if his research holds, connects a Welsh megalith to an Egyptian god, to a Thai royal barge, to the robes of an Arabian king, all in one continuous thread of human communication stretching back to before the Toba eruption of 79,000 BC. The next time you see a ceremonial object and think it is just decoration, it might be worth asking what it is actually saying. Because according to an unknown soldier, we have been surrounded by the answer for a very long time. We just forgot how to read it.